Welcome to Light Over Heat with Professor David Yamani. This week I have part 4 of the standard model of explaining the irrationality of defensive gun ownership. Before I get to part 4, let me review the first 3 points in the standard model of explaining the irrationality of defensive gun ownership. The first point acknowledges the existence of gun culture 2.0. That is, the core of American gun culture today is centered on self-defense. The second point in the standard model argues that guns are neither used nor useful for self-defense. And point 3 says, in contrast, guns actually add risk of negative outcomes. Taking those 3 points together, then we get point 4, which is therefore defensive gun ownership is irrational. Now, this is not a new idea, and in fact, when I did my top 10 list of books on guns in America, I included this book called Firearms and Violence in American Life by Newton and Zimring, published in 1969. And a lot of what we see in the public health research on firearms in America today can be found in a kernel form in this book. Chapter 10 of this book covers firearms and self-defense, and in the summary at the very start of the book, the authors lay out their position that the gun is rarely an effective means of protection. This is point 2. Possession of a gun undoubtedly provides a measure of comfort to a great many Americans, but for the homeowner, this comfort is largely an illusion bought at the price of increased accidents, homicides, and more widespread illegal use of guns. Now, they don't mention suicide as a negative outcome, but here they clearly cover point 3, that guns add risk. They give people an illusion of safety, right? And when they talk about that you're buying this illusion of safety at the price of negative outcomes, really this clearly represents point 4, that defensive gun ownership is irrational. It's an illusion. If we fast forward a couple of decades, we find Kellerman and Ray's 1986 article that I've mentioned in a previous video. They argue that for every case of self-protection homicide involving a firearm kept in the home, there were 1.3 accidental deaths, 4.6 criminal homicides, and 37 suicides involving firearms. Therefore, they conclude the advisability of keeping firearms in the home for protection must be questioned. It's not a rational weighing of the risks and the benefits of gun ownership. The risks far outweigh any possible benefits of gun ownership. We can fast forward another several decades and find a very contemporary piece of scholarship on the negative outcomes associated with gun ownership by David Studdert and his colleagues. I've talked about this piece also in a previous video. But Studdert and his colleagues look at the secondhand risks of gun ownership, among other things they investigate. And this is how they conclude their 2022 paper. If firearms ownership enhanced personal safety in other ways, as many gun owners reportedly believe, tolerating some elevated risk for suicide might be considered a worthwhile trade-off. This study adds to mounting evidence that no such trade-off exists. There's no trade-off between enhancing your safety by owning defensive firearms, right? This is point number 2 in the standard model. Guns are neither used nor useful for self-defense. Rather, you are paying a higher price in terms of negative outcomes like suicide or secondhand risk of homicide or homicide risk, right? And in making that non-worthwhile trade-off, you're actually acting irrationally, right? You are underplaying the risks and overplaying the benefits of defensive gun ownership. You are acting irrationally. Of course, this conclusion is based on these 2 previous points in the standard model, right? Point 2, that guns are neither used nor useful for self-defense, and that guns add risk of negative outcomes. And in previous videos, I've highlighted some of the limitations of those 2 points. And if those 2 points have limitations, then maybe point 4, the conclusion that defensive gun ownership is irrational, may not be taken as seriously as the standard model would have you take it. Be that as it may, the conclusion that defensive gun ownership is irrational leads to the 5th and final point in the standard model, namely that defensive gun ownership is just a pretense or a prop, and that something else is actually motivating it other than a rational risk calculation. Look forward to talking about that in next week's video. In the meantime, if you have comments on this video or the video series in general, please leave them. I'm anxious to hear what you think.